Hey everybody, my name is Christian Swenson. I do videos here on YouTube about autism, autistic consciousness, and life on the autism spectrum. It's been a bit, it's been like 2 weeks. There's no real reason. I just didn't do it because I was going out of town, but I stopped before we went out of town, so that's no excuse. But it's good. It's good to have a time away from speaking to do some thinking. Now, that's not like a breakup talk or anything. Like, I've been thinking, we need to talk. No, it's more like I've been thinking and I can see what I'm doing better, and I can do it better now. That's why Sundays or weekends are great, is because you can not only work, but like reflect on the week. Like, oh, that was a stupid week, wasn't it? But you don't maybe think that in the week. Well, do you feel invisible? Like, do you feel like people don't see you? Or actually, if you're autistic, you probably feel too visible. Too visible. So it's like you're like, oh, I just did an autistic thing. I just chewed on my pen. I just, what did I do? I ignored some social taboo. And everyone's looking at me now. So you feel very visible. You feel like you're naked in front of a stage. But at the same time, you feel invisible. So you feel like people don't see you. And at the same time, they see you very much, but in the wrong way. And that's really the key here, is in the wrong way. Do they see you as what you'd like to be seen as? That's the real question. And that's really the paradox of disability, isn't it? Disability is probably not the best word. There's a whole field called disability studies that seems to be written from a perspective. Disability studies was probably invented by someone who didn't have a disability. I'm probably wrong about that. But disability itself implies a focus from ability, and disability is simply the lack of ability. And, that basically implies that the person with disability is simply seen as a deficient human being. Like, they're a human being, but maybe less of one. And, that's a bit of a problem. But, we all know that struggle if you're here. The struggle of seeming normal in some ways, especially if you're masking a bit more at the moment, and seeming less normal in the times when you aren't able to mask, or you just are acting very autistic. And that's a struggle, right? It's not a struggle for the person who's not disabled. They take normality for granted. They take lots of things for granted, and you do too. Don't get me wrong. You take, like, if you're white, I'm white. If you're white, you take your whiteness for granted, right? It's hard not to, but there's a kind of a blindness, to use a disability metaphor, that arises in people who are able. They're able or unable to see the world in non-default settings. It's like in a video game, they haven't adjusted the default settings. They're still using the default resolution. They haven't messed with things. And, that's nice, I guess, but it's also rather boring. Like, oh, this is just what people do. This is how people see. This is how people act, they say. And they are threatened by anything that upsets that norm. There's a book I love. I've referenced it more than a few times on this channel. It's called Plant Intelligence and the Imaginal Realm. Best title in the world. And one of the things he says, kind of like a mantra he repeats throughout the whole text, is this: you must not extend awareness further than society wants it to go. I'll repeat that. You must not extend awareness further than society wants it to go. That's not his mantra. He repeats it as something that society says. He repeats it as something that is drilled into us, as a kind of super ego that says, if you see differently, if you perceive more, you're dangerous. I have a friend who has a brother, and this brother was a rational type. He was a scientist. He maybe a doctor, I don't know. But he was, someone who sees the world as a machine and ignores the fact that people see the world differently from each other. So guess what happened when he smoked marijuana for the first time? He had to take a few days off of work because he was having an existential crisis. Not necessarily spurred on by the effects of the marijuana, unless you mean because the marijuana poked a hole in one of his assumptions, which is that everybody sees the world in the same way, and that the world is what it looks like to me right now. It isn't. You take some drugs, you'll know that the world looks differently to different folks. And the world looks differently to autistic people than it does to what we call neurotypical people. And it looks differently, I would wager, from one autistic person to the next. And that threatens many people, the assumption that people can see the world differently, because it shows that the world is more than it looks like. It shows that there's more to the world than naive perception suggests. Why do you think psychedelics are illegal? Like, people started taking psychedelics in the 60s, and I was like, oh no, this threatens every societal assumption. Let's make them illegal, because the legal system itself is threatened by what is revealed through these plants. And autism is the same way. We are a threat to the systems. Not because necessarily we say things or do things that threaten them, but because we see things that threaten them. The assumption that someone could see the world differently, that the world could reveal itself differently to one person than to another person, threatens society in good and bad ways. And so society says, don't show that you see differently. Don't show what you see. Ignore it. Hide it. Mask it. Pretend to be normal. Now, don't get me wrong. There are advantages in pretending to be normal, right? You will make people less uncomfortable, for one, and that's sometimes a good thing, right? That's why we have trigger warnings. We don't want to make people too uncomfortable. But it also makes you safer, right? Because not everybody's nice. But it has many drawbacks, right? If you're trying to pretend to be normal, you spend much more energy on things most people spend very little on. And so you burn out much more quickly. Because you're focusing on pretending to be normal, you don't focus on, ironically, what other people are focusing on and what you would focus on too if you weren't focused on your appearance. And so you are oblivious, more oblivious. And you forget, because it's a kind of lying, really. You start to forget what your authentic reactions are, and then you start to confuse what you should do with what your impulses, with what your instincts, with what your intuitions are telling you, right? It's not to say we shouldn't ever question our instincts. We should. Instincts can be wrong sometimes, or instincts can be reacting to an inappropriate situation, or reacting inappropriately. But it's a bad idea to make an enemy of your instincts. It generally is a bad idea to split the human being. The human being should be a whole human being, from head to toe, head and arms and heart, right? And unfortunately, that's what we call masking does. But so, the more you become visible, right, in one way, right, the more you pretend to be normal, the more invisible you become in another way, because, that's what normality means, is invisibility. But it's like they're tied together in a kind of dance. I'm not explaining it rather well. So as you can see, it's like that paradox, right? The normal, neurotypical person, they don't have to spend energy being normal. They just are. And too bad for them, really. I mean, just to fade back into the background noise. I mean, I know there's a joy in succumbing to peer pressure, but it's not a joy I've ever experienced, and it's the joy of being accepted by friends, but it gets you to do awful things often. It's where bullying comes from often. It's where prejudice begins. Often, it's like Men in Black, that it's like a person is smart, says the older man in black. People are stupid. Right? You get people together, they're all looking at each other like, what should we do? What should we do? We're following each other, and all of a sudden, mob mentality begins. Twitter does that. Twitter's stupid. Twitter and social media in general, I say, using a social media site, right? We're looking at each other like, what should I do? Is this appropriate? Is that appropriate? Well, if everybody's looking at each other, no one's really looking at the environment. And that's why we need autistic people, right? That's why we need people with disabilities, is because in the act of failing to be normal, we focus on what normality doesn't focus on, which might be the environment, in the case of Greta Thunberg, right? An autistic young woman who, being autistic, doesn't live in the social world, and she sees the climate catastrophe that for the rest of us is already dull background noise. That's the beauty of autistic people, right? And it's funny, my wife is from Sweden and she does not like Greta. I do. Mixed political orientation marriage. But and I think it's because in Sweden, like, you don't skip school. That's like something you don't do. So it's really radical what she's doing. More to Swedes than to Americans. And, well, the reason I'm talking about disability and visibility, they're similar words, aren't they, right? Invisibility, disability, ability, all of those words, they kind of sound like each other. I have a disability cloak. Dumbledore gave it to me for Christmas. It's but my aunt, my mom had 7 siblings. That's Utah for you, right? My mom was born in 1968. My aunt was born in 1980. So that tells you something, right? She has fibromyalgia. She's really, she experiences this pain in her body. It does what fibromyalgia does. It affects her world. It affects her life. So we just got back from Disneyland. Full disclosure. That's one of the reasons I was out of commission. The last time we went to Disneyland was before the pandemic hit. And so like January 2020. So I'm there with her, there with my grandparents, her parents, and we're leaving Disneyland. We're going to get something to eat before we hit I-15. And she gets pulled over. And because she was doing some weird driving. And she is asked to step out of the car. And she fails the tests for sobriety. Now, why do you think she failed the test for sobriety? First of all, she's what people call Mormon, as am I, right? So neither of us has ever tasted a drop of alcohol in her life, in our lives, and so sobriety's okay, right? She's on prescription drugs, but they're regular prescription drugs that she's following as prescribed for depression. But she has fibromyalgia, so she does the test, and she fails it because of the sensations and the disabilities in her relationship with her body. And she's taken into custody. I was in the car at the time, as well as my sister and her younger Down syndrome sister. She was inconsolable. She was sobbing. And I said, can't you do something to the other policeman? And he did a piss poor job of trying to comfort her, right? They took her to the police station in the local area. They gave her a breathalyzer test. It came back negative. They did it multiple times because they didn't believe it, right? And eventually they let her go. But recently we found out that they are pressing charges. And it's ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. It's ableist. It is prejudiced. And it is cruel. It's part of America's broken police system, right? I have mixed feelings about the whole defund the police idea, but there is inefficiency and there is cruelty in the structures of policing in the United States. And it could be improved. But so what my mom has started is a GoFundMe, I think, raising money for her legal fees. You can find more information there. That's why I'm talking about what I'm talking about today. In addition to whatever autistic stuff we're talking about, is because you folks know what it's like to be judged as deficient or immoral because of what people call a disability. And maybe some of you know what it's like to be legally held accountable for some of these things. We've made a lot of money on this GoFundMe so far. Anything any of you can donate, if it's like $5 or even $2 or even $1, anything would help. And honestly, the money helps, but what helps perhaps even more is the gesture of donation. Because my aunt felt invisible for the long time between January 2020 and when we got this GoFundMe started. She felt like she wasn't being seen. She felt like she was just assumed to be an immoral person because of something she couldn't help. So, how about you help her? Right? Just a little bit, right? You don't have to, right? I'm not extorting you. It's not going to go to me, right? I hope YouTube allows this. If not, I don't know. I guess I'll do something. But I would appreciate it incredibly if you did something to show your support. Maybe some of you are secretly very wealthy. Maybe you were born, maybe you're a secret aristocrat. Maybe you just inherited like $10 million from your grandfather you didn't realize was a secret millionaire or whatever, right? And so maybe you can help, and maybe I'm doing the right thing by doing this. I hope I am. But like I said, I've been taking a few weeks off. It's good to stand back from things, to see them in a new way, okay? I don't know if you've noticed, maybe you haven't, maybe I'm imagining it, but I imagine that I have developed new ways of speaking, of thinking, of connecting things, of seeing patterns in the last few weeks. I might be imagining this, but I think I've made a breakthrough in language learning, in learning French for graduate school and Swedish for my marriage. So we'll see how that works. But I'll be back, I think, tomorrow. So Wednesday the 21st, if it goes according to plan. I'll be back tomorrow talking about that disaster, that catastrophe along these lines, the ABA shock therapy. And you've probably heard about that, right? And it is a disaster, and it is catastrophe. You know where the word disaster and catastrophe come from, by the way? They're astrological words. I'll talk about that more too, right? Not aligning with the stars. Disaster, catastrophe, right? Same idea. And astrology affects our language and our concepts more than we might like to imagine, right? You have a clock. Well, it has 12, right? Even though there's 24 hours in a day. Guess what? That's an astrological thing. So is your week, by the way. 7 planets in the traditional astrological world. Ta-da! Sunday, Moon Day, Saturn Day, Venus Day, Vendredi in French. So, yeah, thank you for watching. Thank you for tuning back in. Thank you for paying attention again. And I will see you tomorrow, or at least you'll see me. Take care.